Restriction isn't just the really obvious skipping of meals or cutting out whole food groups. In my experience, both personally with an eating disorder and working with people who are in recovery from an eating disorder, so much restriction is actually quite invisible to the untrained eye. So much of an eating disorder lives in the rules, the compensations, and really just like getting you to jump through hoops. A lot of this isn't actually visible from the outside. It's actually very possible for you to look like you have a normal intake or a normal relationship with food when actually you are trapped within such a mental cage of an eating disorder. It is really just all of the rules around food, around movement, about compensation, about how do I fit it all into a day, that while it might look normal, the outcome might look quite normal, and we have to quote unquote that, but actually you've just been stuck following a whole bunch of rigid rules. And I think in some ways this can actually make it even harder to recover. There can be this extra hurdle where the eating disorder kind of goes, well, you're actually eating normally. Like, what's wrong? This is a perfectly adequate intake. What you're doing is what everybody does. It really just tries to invalidate you so that you don't seek help, so that you don't actually pursue recovery. And that invalidation itself is a symptom of the eating disorder. So I really want to talk through, I guess, some of the ways that really invisible, insidious, sneaky restriction shows up. Some of those things that really might not be obvious to the outside world. And to really encourage you to kind of get curious yourself, really interrogate, get honest about where is restriction showing up, even if it's in kind of these invisible ways. So firstly, this again is like, it's not, so we're going with the ones that aren't obvious. These are not going to be obvious to people around you, unless perhaps they've been through an eating disorder themselves. But firstly, it is monitoring the amount of food that you're eating compared to other people. So it's this feeling of either wanting to match, or usually the eating disorder wants you to eat a little bit less than other people. Most people won't notice that. That's a pretty invisible behavior, but it's one that comes up time and time again with an eating disorder. So we have to get very savvy, and we have to recognize that that's an eating disorder behavior. And my job, if I'm in recovery, is to do exactly the opposite of that behavior, of that suggestion. So that means that I have to go out of my way to eat more than other people. And that could also be related to the pace at which you eat. I think it's also pretty common for people to want to eat the slowest, so they don't finish their plate first. And again, if you're in recovery, if you recognize that little restriction, it's your job to do the opposite. So it's about getting the most, eating the most, and eating as quickly as you can, eating so that you aren't eking it out and that you're forcing yourself to be the last one to eat. I remember this was really, really, I don't know, distressing for me. And it didn't make logical sense to me at the time. There are reasons, I think biological reasons, that does make sense. But at the time it felt wacky, and it felt really uncomfortable to be the one to eat the most and to finish first. And it wasn't that I was actually forcing myself to eat quickly. It wasn't that. It was that I was letting myself eat at the pace that I wanted to, rather than forcing myself to eat slowly. So maybe you resonate with that. So just, have a bit of a think about if that might be the case for you, if that might be an eating disorder behavior, and what you can do to really challenge it and do the opposite. Secondly, it is just skipping all of the extras. So we're talking sauces, we're talking toppings, we're talking maybe sides. It's pretty easy to these days say, oh, I'll, have that without the mayonnaise, or without the salad dressing, or dressing on the side, sauce on the side. And that can look pretty normal. That might be normal for some people. I'm not here to pass judgment on anyone else's food rules or food behaviors. I'm here to say that that's probably a form of invisible restriction, that Everyone else is going to just be like, oh yeah, that's pretty normal. I do that too. We're all allowed preferences. Some people simply don't like mayonnaise. That's okay. But if your eating disorder really doesn't like it and really doesn't want you to have it, that's where we have to recognize it as restriction. And usually, especially early on in recovery, there's too much eating disorder getting in there to actually know your true preferences. So while you might say, I don't like that, I don't like this, I don't like guacamole, who are you? It's not about that right now. It is not about whether or not you like it. It is about whether or not your eating disorder is really uncomfortable with you doing that. So I think skipping, as I say, these extras, quote unquote extras, is another really insidious way that the eating disorder shows up. That is that invisible restriction. Thirdly is clock watching. It's, again, it's not obvious, but if you know that you are watching the clock and counting down until you're next allowed to eat, that's restriction. You're clearly hungry. It's mental hunger. You're definitely wanting more food, but you're not going to let yourself. So again, just be really conscious of that. Recognize it for what it is, that clock watching being invisible restriction, it being a form of mental hunger, and that's actually a sign from your body that you need to go and get more food right here and right now. Fourth is measuring or portioning out your food to make sure that you don't eat too much. Again, this is a behavior that is so normalized, people might not even recognize it. People might even pass it off as, well, I have to measure to make sure that I've got enough for recovery. And if you're in any doubt that you might have underportioned yourself, you just simply pour more in your bowl or put more on your plate. We don't need to measure anything out to make sure that you're having enough. Really, truly, honestly, recognize that the weighing and the portioning is actually to put a cap on it. That's actually your eating disorder wanting a feeling of control, wanting to say, oh, there is a limit here and you can't go past it. Fifth is using low calorie or low fat anything. So we're talking, your spreads, your yogurt, whatever it is. If you're picking the lower calorie option, again, it might look like from the outside, no one else is looking at your packaging. You've got a bowl of yogurt and granola. Great. But if you're actually restricting by using the low fat yogurt or the low calorie yogurt, then really that restriction is still going on, even if you can pass it off to the outside world as you being normal, having a perfectly normal relationship with food. And please don't misunderstand this. I'm not saying that anyone who eats low fat or low calorie anything has a disordered relationship with food. Not at all. I'm saying for someone in recovery from an eating disorder, that is not the pro-recovery choice. That is holding hands. That is restricting what you actually need to be doing in order to rewire. Sixth is using any form of movement or any form of even productivity to justify eating. So it is, again, not obvious, but if you have to, if you feel compelled to, go for that walk, do jobs around the house, not sit down to justify either what you have eaten or what you're going to eat later, that's restriction. That is invisible restriction that a lot of other people will say, well, it's pretty normal to, want to go for a walk after you've had lunch. Yeah, great. That is fine when you have got a energy balanced, fully rewired brain and body, where those two things are entirely disconnected. But that's not the reality very often when you're in recovery. So let's just call that what it is, call it disordered, call it restriction, and not let it happen. Go and do the opposite. Go and rest and go and get more snacks. Seventh is basing future food decisions on past food decisions, so or vice versa, but essentially that micromanagement. Again, from the outside, no one else knows that you're jumping through those hoops. No one else can see it, but that is what's going to keep you in a mental cage. So it doesn't matter that what you're eating over the course of the day might be considered normal from the outside. If you know that you are doing that trade-off, if you're making those compensations throughout the day, then you have to address it. That is restriction. That is not, unconditional permission to eat that is heavily micromanaged. And that behavior really does need to be challenged if you want to reach full freedom. And finally, it's this idea that every plate needs to be balanced. There has to be, in particular, protein and vegetables. The eating disorder typically gets less worried about other macronutrients that are arguably more important to your body. So it's really, again, these things might be normalized. I know in this super hyper protein world that this is kind of encouraged as the gold standard for how you should eat. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying it's not more important than all of the other macronutrients, especially when you're in recovery from an eating disorder. So I really encourage you to get curious and to think, am I hyper conscious of balancing my plate? Do I really resist having an unbalanced plate? And again, recognize it for what it is, that this is restriction, that other people might not call it out, other people might normalize it, other people might do that. That's fine. They're not you. They're not in recovery from a restrictive eating disorder. And if they are, it also doesn't matter. It's your recovery and it's your life that you have to choose what path you want to take. So these are just some of the ways that invisible restriction really showed up for me. It's not the be all and end all. I'm sure there's loads more. There were even others in my experience, but I'm sure you have your own ways that this shows up. I guess what I'm trying to get at here with this video is to really encourage you to get curious, to get really honest with yourself, to acknowledge, where is this restriction showing up? Okay, from the outside, it might look normal. It might look socially acceptable. But where is that restriction showing up? Because if you don't feel free around food, then you haven't rooted out all of that restriction. Where are those rules for you? And then the next step is to break those rules, is to go in the opposite direction as far as you can. Recovery isn't about having an intake that is acceptable to the outside world. It is about dismantling all of those food rules, all of those neural networks that uphold your eating disorder, and replace them with networks based around food abundance, based around a disconnection from food and movement, and based around total and complete freedom, unconditional permission to eat. And this will mean behaving in a way where the goal is to gain weight. I know that sounds hard, but if you can shift your behavior to align with that goal, you will be able to root out all of this restriction, because the goal is to behave in a way that your eating disorder fundamentally disapproves of. Because we aren't aiming to appear recovered. We are aiming for total and complete confidence that you are free. So don't let those sneaky, invisible restrictions get in the way, because recovery and full freedom only happens when every single one of those restrictive behaviors is gone.